Hi there everyone, welcome back to On the Flip Side. My name is Adam Shawwalker, your host, and today we're going to be checking out this new self-titled album from the Mars Volta. This is the first new album from the Mars Volta in 10 years, the last record they put out being 2012's Nocturnicate. An album that I've heard mostly negative or mixed feedback on. Personally, I think it's alright, but it was the band's departure from a lot of what made them so fantastic and captivating in the first place. A lot of that insane, labyrinthian songwriting was just stripped back to a much easier to digest form. And there are still touches and writing sensibilities that remained that were distinctly the Mars Volta, and it seems that on this return 10 years later, they have elected to develop on those very distinctive touches of DNA. And what this whole album ends up being, or at least what most of this record feels like, is an attempt at making alternative pop tracks, and for the most part, achieving some amount of success with that. I think the singles that were dropped leading up to this album did leave me a little bit baffled at the time, like Blacklight Shine or Graveyard Love or Vigil, all of which with the context of the album are a lot better than the initial impressions had me thinking that they could be. And it's not that I even hated those tracks, actually I really enjoyed them. I think I was just hoping or maybe expecting something like the material from Amputecture or any of their older albums. But getting past that link to those older albums, this is a solid little record for the most part, and while I think that moving away from their old sound would have been a bummer, it only would have really sucked if this material was just terrible. Do I think this material is better? Not really. In some cases, at some points, maybe a little bit, but it would be better for entirely different reasons than their back catalog if it was better. So I think I'm pretty happy with what's here. For the most part, my thoughts on this album are mostly positive. Blacklight Shine and Graveyard Love have only really grown on me since their initial releases. I don't have too much to say on them past what I've already said about them, but they are still quite good, and indeed even better with the rest of the tracks here to lend them some context and some added flow. Shore Story is a really mellow track, very subdued in its writing. Frankly, this song is really hitting me with some maybe like mid-90s Porcupine Tree. Sonically, it's ringing the same bell as like the intro to The Sky Moves Sideways, but with more of like a modern touch. Really digging the beat for this one. Also enjoying the glitched out production, which is really great as well because they use it for these very light embellishments that are very solid, but just don't really go overboard. It's pretty decently balanced. Blank Condolences is a pretty decent cut. Really enjoying the raw lyrics. They are still very proggy and leave a lot of things up to interpretation, but I like that even with this shift in sound that the ever-constant puzzling prog rock lyrics have remained. And prog lyrics have really been a hit and miss thing for me on a lot of albums, but I find that most of them are pretty solid on this album. It's not like it's trying to paint some sort of mystical portrait of dragons and adventure like a bunch of the classic progressive rock stuff. I'm thinking in this case it's kind of trying to get out like more complex emotional thought by translating that into a direct word-by-word stream, which is a little bit of a risky move, but the writing here is done quite well, and they're mostly savvy enough to use some really creative language during that process. Vigil was the last single I listened to from this album. Wasn't as excited about it when I heard it. I thought it was kind of weak as far as like love songs go, but it does work a little bit better with the context of this record as a whole, but even still, this is probably one of the songs on this album that I'm not particularly fond of. Que Dios te maldiga mi corazón, I think is one of the better tracks on this album, with this really great, quick and to the point Latin-influenced track that mostly acts as like an interlude, but even still is pretty solid. Cerulean has some excellent vocal work. Again, it's hitting on more of a love song-focused motif. A lot of the lyrics on this one feel very Midwest emo-influenced in a way, not in the same kind of like I can't stand this town kind of way, but it's definitely despondent in a simple yet hard to really get way. You know, like it's personal. I do wish it was maybe a little bit less melodramatic, but it's still pretty good. Flash Burns from Flashbacks is one of my favorite tracks on the album. It's giving me some very direct Radiohead, Yesterday I Woke Up Sucking on a Lemon vibes. And come to think of it, this album as a whole kind of sounds like the Mars Volta doing their take on Radiohead at a lot of points. It's really like if the King of Limbs was good. Palm Full of Crux has a pretty similar approach to their last track, though with some jazzier flares, lots of calm sax work here that's quite good. I could see this being one of the bigger tracks here personally. It's kind of like if you took the more symphonic elements from like Moonchild by King Crimson and just isolated them. No Case Gain feels a little bit more like the Mars Volta's earlier material, especially with its more upbeat energy level. It does still leave a little bit to be desired, but it's a decent track. Tourmaline is a really interesting track because it is just so stripped stripped down and intimate, and it just builds and develops brilliantly in like 3.5 minutes, and most bands would have a hard time doing what they do on this track in like double that amount of time, so I really like this track. It makes me just appreciate how much thought was put into the writing here, because even with like 14 tracks, this album is only like 40 minutes, so it's kind of easy to shrug these songs off, but when you think about it, I think that what they've done here is really cut out a lot of the fluff for this album. And What Remains, I don't entirely love. In fact, I do have problems with a lot of it, but it is still a very catered experience. Everything does in fact have its place, and I feel like that is just missing on so many albums lately. Equus 3, I think, is probably my favorite track here. Love the structure of this song. I dig how it all kind of comes in waves. It's very solid. Huge fan of the bass work here. The drums and synths are excellent as well. Collapsible Shoulders backpedals a bit into the more pop-focused sound, but I'm really loving the electronic production on this track. It's really minimal, but it feels very forward-thinking. I'm enjoying the switch between vocal styles a lot too, and the whole cut is only like 2.5 minutes, but it's just very nicely put together. The final song, Requisition, as a closing track, leaves a little bit to be desired, especially since this is the longest cut on the album. You would think that things would maybe even go a little bit further. But even still, while they do hit on that more complex prog rock stuff here pretty hard, I just think that the couple of minutes that they spend on it end up being kind of underwhelming in comparison to the fairly monolithic tracks that they put out during the mid-2000s. Like, I do think it ends up being a decent closer for a mostly decent album. So what is the deal here? Like, do I like this or do I hate this? And I like it. I don't think it's reinventing the wheel musically, but I do think it is trying to build more on Nocturnicate for sure. I am kind of liking the Kid A style that a lot of this album has toyed with. I do find a lot of what's here, while not particularly original and largely derivative, to at least be decent past some of the more obvious pulls. But yeah, I think this is the Mars Volta at their best when they aren't doing prog rock, and that's okay, but in my opinion, they're just not that well suited or equipped for a lot of what's here. Like, yes, nothing on this album is particularly offensive on the ears. It's all very good as far as writing and flow is concerned, but it's also not particularly memorable, with the exception of maybe a handful of tracks, and that's kind of it. I am very glad that they're back together and making new music. That is a blessing in and of itself, and this album is far from anything to be hated or scoffed at, because the production work is genuinely beautiful, and there are ideas here that are floated that are actually quite good. But yeah, I think a lot of this experience, while catered and picked apart and put together in a cohesive way, doesn't really stand on its own too well once you start digging into it. But yeah, I like this new album. I think it's decent. I think this new album, The Mars Volta by The Mars Volta, is a solid 6. Thank you all so much for watching. Let me know what you thought of this album in the comments below. Remember to like and subscribe. Check out my Instagram, my Reverb, and my Depop. Links to those are in the description below. Thank you all so much again for watching, and we'll see you on the flip side.